Deputy President, I rise to support this motion because the state of schools funding in Australia is in a crisis, and this is blindingly apparent to voters right across the political spectrum. Because it's not only a matter now of basic decency, of basic social justice, that in one of the wealthiest nations in the world, that every single child, no matter where they live, should have the opportunity of having high-quality education, as has been our proud tradition since the century before last. This is also actually about investing in Australia's future, investing in Australia's human capital, because we can't afford to squander the human potential that lies within those kids that at the moment are not getting access to a decent education because of their background. But despite all the talking, and even all of the Minister for Education's activity, and there's been some frenzied activity in the last few weeks, recently, he hasn't even acknowledged this crisis, let alone committing to the solution to the crisis, which has been so clearly identified by an expert panel with the Gonski review and many, many commentators across Australia, that we need needs-based funding reform that would begin to resolve the crisis. So just last week, again, we had Minister Pyne saying, quotes, "I don't believe there is an equity problem in Australia," despite all the evidence, despite what the commentators almost with one voice are saying. He doesn't believe it. And unfortunately, it's very clear that neither does Prime Minister Abbott, and indeed, unfortunately, it appears that the coalition itself doesn't. And yet I know there must be members of the coalition government who absolutely know that there is a crisis in the way we're doing business in schools funding in Australia today. And I ask myself, what about those politicians, what about those national politicians, for instance, who live in country areas? Because the evidence is really clear that small schools, that remote schools, that kids in the country are not getting their fair share. They're not getting their access to high-quality education that kids in other wealthier, more privileged areas of Australia are getting. How do they talk to their constituents about that? How do they reconcile that inequity? And the Minister for Education, in lurching from position to reworded, nuanced, tweaked and massaged position on this issue, has been selling the furphy that it's not a dollar figure which will fix declining educational performance. It's things like teacher quality. Of course teachers matter, of course teachers' quality matters. But that's not to suggest that we don't have a fine workforce in Australia. There may be some changes that can be made in terms of the training and the assistance and the support that teachers come out with, teachers who are often extremely idealistic but often end up leaving the profession far too soon because they are not supported and they are faced with conditions like casualisation, lack of support, lack of mentoring. So there are certainly some things we can do there. And of course the curriculum matters, because we need to provide modern Australian kids this century with a rich, diverse curriculum that stimulates thinking and creativity. But as well as any coalition member of parliament knows, of course money matters too, especially in education. It's what pays for teachers. It's what pays for infrastructure. It's what pays for the buildings that the kids sit in when they learn. It's what pays for materials. It's what pays for technology. Education is about human relationships if it's not about anything else. Human relationships are labour-intensive and they are costly. Of course it matters. When a school can't afford enough paper for the year and parents are asked to put their hands in their pockets to bail out the school, parents who come from backgrounds who don't have a lot of disposable income, let alone paying for new textbooks, of course money matters. Money matters when kids huddle under blankets because the school heating system has failed. How can they learn when they're cold? Of course money matters. And of course money matters when computers stop working, as in a school I visited recently, and for a period of time they're offline. They can't do it because they haven't got the means to get those computers fixed quickly. And when struggling kids, the struggling disadvantaged kids that need the most attention, when they can't get that, because the school can't afford more teachers, it can't afford more student support officers. But then before we even have the debate on the quality of the teachers, we know, of course, that money matters. And if it didn't, let's ask ourselves seriously, if money didn't matter, if money isn't the answer to these things or isn't part of the answer to these things, I keep asking myself, why is it? Why is it that some of the most wealthy schools in Australia are fighting so hard to make sure they won't lose a single dollar under a transformed model? So let's look at the numbers then. Yes, the numbers are there to demonstrate that we've spent more overall on school funding over the last decade. And yes, educational standards have declined, and there's plenty of empirical research to show this. We know that our lowest performing students in Australia are as many as 8 years behind our highest performing students, and that is absolutely shameful. But in fact, it isn't a paradox that we have spent more on education and we have got less, because it is about where we have spent that money and how we have spent that money that matters. We have spent more inequitably, and we have therefore, not surprisingly, ended up with more inequitable outcomes. Because Australia is the third lowest funder of public education in the OECD. And the figures also show that under the Gonski reform's predecessor, the funding model, including the infamous SES funding model, to which Minister Pyne harks back with some nostalgia. Even last week he refused to rule out that we would return to that system. Wealthy private schools in Australia received millions and millions more funding each year. The most affluent private schools have received the biggest boost in funding in the 10 years that the Howard Government administered the SES model. The Department of Education in New South Wales figures show that funding for the wealthiest private primary schools in New South Wales, already wealthy, grew by more than 80% between 2000 and 2010, and funding for elite private high schools rose by 50%. By contrast, funding for the most disadvantaged high schools, the most disadvantaged that are struggling to educate the most disadvantaged kids in Australia, rose by a measly 12%, and primary schools by only 25%. Now, the reforms set out in the Australian Education Act, while far from a perfect implementation of the Gonski Review, and we discussed that a lot before we ended up agreeing to pass the Act, went a long way towards establishing a sustainable needs-based funding model which would correct these years of inequity and start to get us back on the path to universal high-quality education. Minister Pyne, in his role as Shadow Education Minister in the election campaign, committed to maintaining the reformed school funding model from the 1st of January 2014 for 4 years with the same funding envelope. It was pretty unequivocal, and the Australian public understood that's what he was signing up to. Now he's the minister. He's flagged walking away from this commitment to needs-based funding. He's never acknowledged that there's an equity problem in Australia's education system, and walking away from education reform which would require that the funding that the Commonwealth provides goes to those schools that most need it, where the most disadvantaged kids are, failing to require that commitment is walking away from that needs-based model. It's not just that the minister needs to uphold his pre-election commitments to needs-based funding, but he must also commit to overall dollar figures for school funding as well. But he also needs to actually really sign up and care about this issue. He needs to acknowledge the evidence that so many other people in Australia have been acknowledging for so long, that there is a genuine inequality in our schooling systems and it is not serving our nation well. It compounds disadvantage, it squanders human potential, it has the capacity and the likelihood of actually creating greater gulfs and greater differences and greater social dislocation in our country. And it's a cost to society, even in terms of lost productivity alone, which is too great to pay. So the Australian Greens are calling on the government to match what the previous government committed to, because we have to ensure that we invest in our students and all students in Australia, so that no child's performance at school is dependent on wealth, power, income or possessions. We have to have a system in Australia so that every single kid can achieve their potential no matter where they live or whatever their background.